Parents of missing children, what happened? My older sister was a chronic runaway in her troubled teen years. She was the oldest of many, and my parents didn't know how to handle her defiance. They thought discipline meant getting stricter, even resorting to violence. That's when she began running away. I remember the police showing up at our house more than once, probing me for information like I was some kind of witness to a crime. One night, she said goodbye before vanishing. Thinking I could save her, I told the adults, but it only made things worse. After that, she never warned me again, and every time she vanished, it felt like a dagger in my heart. Over the next 3 years, she disappeared 6 or 7 times, sometimes for months, leaving the cops scrambling to find her. It was terrifying, not knowing where she was or if she was safe. But then, something changed. She found a counseling program and slowly started to turn her life around. Eventually, she came back to us, and I can't express how grateful I am to have her in my life again. It's a relief to know she's finally found her way back, but sometimes I wonder if those dark days are truly behind her. It's tough to see a sibling go through that. Running away seems like a desperate way to cope with strictness, especially with everything changing in the family. Talking to the police must have been hard for you, but it sounds like you were just trying to protect her. It's good that she found help and turned things around. Having her back must feel nice after all the uncertainty. My sister went missing when I was just a kid. For a week, no one could find her. It wasn't unusual since she had gotten tangled up with the wrong crowd. But then they found her body. I still can't fathom how my dad handled that. I think he threw himself into raising me, my brother, and my niece who lost her mother that day. She still struggles with it, you know? My dad, he's a rock, so strong and kind. But I know that strength came at a price. He had to learn to cope with a horror that most can't even imagine. The pain never really goes away. It just lurks beneath the surface. It sounds like a tough situation for your family. Losing a loved one, especially at a young age, can really impact everyone. Your dad's strength in raising you and your brother after such a loss shows a lot about his character. It's clear he has dealt with a lot, and it must be hard for your niece too. It's good that he has support from you all. My aunt's 2 youngest sons vanished when they were just 8 and 10. Their lives in Alaska, with its endless wilderness, made it easy for their mother's ex to hide them away. The eldest son, instead of coming forward, helped his father keep them hidden. For 4 long years, they were fugitives living under the radar, until one day, fate caught up with them. The father, desperate to escape, tried to board a ferry to Russia. But the security guard's eyes were sharp. He recognized those familiar faces. In that moment, the boys were pulled from the shadows and brought back into the light. When they returned to my aunt, I saw them during a visit to my grandparents' house last summer. They were teenagers now, but they carried a heavy silence with them, wearing their trauma like a second skin. I couldn't help but feel an ache of pity as they quietly navigated their new world. That's a tough situation. It's hard to imagine what those boys went through all those years. Seems like they've gone through a lot, and it's understandable they'd be quiet and shy after everything. Hopefully, they can start to adjust and heal now that they're back with family. It's good to hear they're safe, though. Being with your aunt must help, but it'll take time for them to feel normal again. My maternal grandmother had 5 children, but the youngest, my aunt, vanished when she was just 20. It all started with a fight between her and her boyfriend at his place. She wanted to leave, but he refused to drive her. So, she made the decision to walk home, which was 2 towns away. After a while, she ended up at the local community college and called him from a pay phone, desperate for a ride. But under the influence of his brother, he turned her down. She tried calling our house next, but there was no answer. The last known sighting of her was at a 7-Eleven, accompanied by a strange Asian man. She was quiet, staring at the floor, and when the cashier asked if she was okay, my aunt didn't respond. Months later, they found her purse in a field, but there was no other trace of her. Nearly 30 years have passed, and still nothing. My aunt was my grandma's baby. Her case made it onto Unsolved Mysteries in America's Most Wanted, capturing attention but yielding no answers. My grandparents spent countless hours and money searching for her, but as the years add up, so does the exhaustion. Thankfully, her case remains open. In a strange way, I think I help my grandmother cope. I resemble my aunt, and it brings her comfort. I was only 2 when she disappeared, but I've always been just a short drive away, regularly visiting. Now, with a child of my own, I feel like I fill a small part of that void. My grandmother is a joyful, loving woman despite it all. But I learned my mother once met the father of Polly Klaas, and he was filled with anger and bitterness. Everyone copes differently, I suppose. Time is a way of dulling the sharp edges of grief. It's sad but true. I won't share names to protect my family's anonymity. Believe what you want, but that's the story. That's a heavy story. It's tough to think about someone going missing and not having any closure. The impact on the family seems profound, especially for your grandmother. It's good to hear you're close to her and that your presence helps a bit. Time can change things, but it's still hard to deal with such a loss. Keep supporting each other. That's what matters most. My sister vanished when we were kids. I searched the entire house, panic rising in my chest. I asked my dad where she was, and he just said, "You ain't gonna find her. She's probably going to die." His words hung heavy in the air, leaving me confused and scared. I cried for days, not knowing what was happening. Then, a few days later, I spotted her, locked away in our shed. It was the dead of winter, and my parents had confined her there because she misbehaved. I later learned it was for something as simple as eating when she wasn't allowed or speaking to my mom. We were warned never to talk to her. She wasn't truly missing, but the fear gripped me so tightly that I couldn't shake it for days. This is pretty unsettling. It sounds like there was a lot of fear and confusion for you as a kid. The way your parents handled it is really shocking and not okay. It's tough to remember those moments when you're so young, but it makes sense why you'd feel scared. Glad your sister was okay, but that experience must have left a mark. My friend and I, both mothers of toddlers, were at the swim club. I asked her to keep an eye on my daughter while I slipped away to the bathroom. As I made my way back, panic surged through me when I realized I didn't see my little girl. I called out to my friend, asking where she was. Her answer chilled me. "I don't know." It felt like ice water running through my veins as I sprinted toward the enormous Olympic-sized pool. And there she was, just a foot from the water's edge, walking straight toward it. My heart raced as I scooped her up, cradling her tightly. The next thing I remember is sitting in my car, clutching her close and sobbing uncontrollably. Somehow, I managed to drive us home, but I still can't shake the haunting question of why my friend let my daughter roam free like that. In the aftermath, our friendship crumbled, leaving behind a shadow of betrayal and fear. That sounds really intense. It's tough when trust gets shattered like that. You have to watch out for your kids, especially in places like pools. Can't imagine how you felt when you saw her by the edge. Sometimes friendships just can't survive situations like this. It's a hard lesson, but keeping your kids safe is what matters most. Hope you're both doing okay now. When I was about 5 or 6, my older brother and I lost our mom in a huge mall. We went to the front, desperate for someone to call her name over the intercom. Minutes passed, and as the silence stretched on, I argued with my brother, convinced she had left without us. He decided to wait, but I was restless. I slipped away, wandering the mall for hours, drifting from store to store, searching for her. I was hard to miss, dressed in a bright red dress, a matching hat perched on my head, and black dress shoes clicking against the floor. I remember passing by 2 officers, locking eyes with one of them, heart racing as I considered asking for help. But I kept moving, drawn into the colorful chaos of toy stores, lost in the moment of play. In reality, my mom had been in that first store the whole time. When she realized I was missing, panic took hold of her. They locked down the mall, and after an hour of searching, officers were dispatched to scour the nearby neighborhoods. My mom was frantic, feeling as though she was fading inside as the minutes dragged on. Eventually, she found me sprawled on the floor of a toy store, blissfully unaware of the chaos I had caused. She called my name, the sound slicing through my world of toys. It was only when we reunited at the security desk with my brother and sister that I saw the storm of tears in her eyes. That's when it hit me. Something was terribly wrong. That's a pretty intense story. Losing track of your mom like that must have been confusing for a kid. It's wild how you just wandered around, playing with toys and not realizing the panic it caused. Sounds like your mom had a really tough time. Glad it ended well with her finding you. Those moments stick with you, even if you don't fully understand them as a child. I was just a kid, around 6 or 7, when I decided to run away. It started with a tantrum, me packing my backpack and telling my parents I was leaving. We lived on a hill near a university, and I thought I could just walk through campus to a friend's house. But then darkness settled in, and after about 10 minutes, fear gripped me. I found myself crying, turning back toward home, sprinting in a panic. When I burst through the door, my parents were in a frenzy, searching everywhere for me, their faces a mix of relief and terror. They thought I was hiding, but in that moment, they were terrified I had actually left and something terrible had happened. Then there was that other time at a dinner party. I fell asleep curled up on a shelf with my favorite stuffed animal. My parents were ready to call the cops, convinced I had vanished, until a family friend stumbled upon me, nestled there, completely unaware of the chaos my absence had caused. It's funny how childhood can feel so intense. Running away seems like a big deal at the time, but it doesn't take long before reality hits. That feeling of panic for both kids and parents is real, though. Also, sleeping on a shelf like that is a bit wild. It's a reminder of how easily kids can find comfort, even in the most unexpected places. Good to hear it all worked out. I was 10, lost in the innocent thrill of a playdate. My friend suggested visiting his grandmother a few streets away, and I thought nothing of it. We wandered into the thick scrub of rural Queensland, and time slipped away. When we finally returned, the world erupted into chaos. My mother was there, her face pale and filled with fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. His parents had panicked, gathering anyone they could find, scouring the bush and the mountains. I could still hear their frantic calls echoing through the trees, the whispers of worry growing louder with every passing moment. What haunted me was the realization that a child had vanished in that very area just a few years before. I never meant to scare anyone, yet the guilt clung to me like a shadow. My mother forbade me from stepping foot in that house again, the memory of that day etched into our lives forever. That sounds pretty intense. It's wild how a simple decision can lead to such a big reaction. I get why you felt guilty, especially with your mom getting upset. It must have been rough not being allowed to hang out with that friend afterward. Those memories can stick with you for a long time. It's tough being a kid and dealing with that kind of stress. My brother vanished in 2005 for an entire week when I was just in 6th grade. He had bipolar disorder, and ever since he turned 12, he barely lived at home. Most of the time, he was in group homes for troubled teens, and once he was even locked up in an asylum. During this particular stretch, he was in a foster home. Something set him off, and he spiraled into a manic episode, so he ran away. This wasn't the first time he'd done it. He often sprinted off during these phases, but he always managed to come back by nightfall. But this time was different. Days passed, and he was nowhere to be found. We plastered his face on milk cartons, flooded the radio waves with ads, even put up missing child signs everywhere. Then, after a week of anguish, he finally called our dad. He had been staying with a friend completely off the grid. Relief washed over us, but the nightmare didn't end there. Once he decided to come home, he arranged for his friend to drive him to Omaha, and that's when he called our dad, a teacher who could have easily taken time off to fetch him. But instead, my dad passed the responsibility to my stepdad, claiming it was too inconvenient to drive an hour. It's insane to think how close we came to a much darker reality. I'm grateful my brother returned safe, but the indifference from our dad still stings. My heart goes out to anyone who hasn't been as lucky. That's a lot to go through at such a young age. Dealing with a family member's mental health issues can be tough, especially when they go missing. It's good to hear that he was okay in the end, but it's understandable to feel mixed emotions about how your dad handled it. Hope things have improved since then for you and your brother. My little brother was obsessed with trains, and that day at the mall, they had a whole setup. My mom told him he had to wait until she finished shopping. We were in a store for what felt like an eternity. 20 minutes of panic, searching every aisle, calling his name. When we finally thought to check near the trains, there he was, standing in line, completely unmoved by the chaos around him. But then there was that other time at Target. He wandered off, and the fear gripped us as we searched frantically. Suddenly, we heard his terrified screams. It shattered the air. Some man was trying to drag him out of the store. I can still feel that moment, heart racing, the horror of realizing how close we were to losing him. That sounds really intense. Losing a sibling in a crowded place can be really frightening. It's good to hear your brother was just waiting by the trains in the first instance. The second story is pretty alarming, though. It's a relief he was okay in the end. Kids can really surprise you with what they get into. Hope your family has a system in place now. My father took my brother when we were just 10 years old. We were twins, but I stayed behind, completely in the dark about what had happened. My mother grew suspicious of my dad, believing he had taken him to Mexico, where he owned property. One day, he simply picked my brother up from school and drove him to someplace outside Guadalajara. A year later, a card arrived containing a few photos. My brother looked mostly happy, smiling beside a dog in what appeared to be a large house. It seemed like a fairy tale on the surface. Then, 2 years later, my brother called from a hotel lobby in Guadalajara, claiming he had escaped and begging us to come get him. My stepdad flew down and brought him back home. I'd always thought the FBI would jump into action when a child goes missing, but they couldn't investigate in another country. They had to rely on local resources, and in cases like this, parental abduction across borders, there wasn't much help to be found. When my brother returned, something felt unnervingly off about him. Just 2 days later, he fell into a catatonic state, repeating our dad's name and spelling it out, rigid on the couch. We rushed him to the county hospital, where he was institutionalized for years and diagnosed with bipolar disorder and psychotic breaks. To this day, we have no idea what happened to him during those years with our father in Mexico. My brother doesn't remember anything and has never spoken about it. The silver lining is that he managed to build a fairly normal life as an adult. He's been happily married for 15 years now, living in Mexico with his wife, a house filled with chihuahuas, and a sense of contentment that seems unshakable. But sometimes, I wonder what truly lies beneath the surface of his smile. That's a tough situation. Growing up with that experience must have been really difficult. It's good to hear that your brother has found some stability and happiness in his adult life. It seems like a lot happened during those years that he can't fully recall. It's interesting how life can take such unexpected turns, but it's nice he found a way to move forward. Overall, sounds like he's doing okay now.